Hi, my name is Mike Milinkovich. I'm the executive director of the Eclipse Foundation, and I've been involved in open source and at the Eclipse Foundation for a little over 18 years now. And my talk today is about open source health and how the evolving definition of what we think of when we talk about a healthy open source project or community, how that has evolved over roughly the last 20 years, and what that means for the future of open source and open source communities. Now, obviously, we're all aware that over the last 20 years, software has really eaten the world. And what's meant by that is that when you look at pretty much every aspect of life today, including, of course, most innovations that are happening in the economy, scientific research, social media, you name it, this is being driven by software. And really, software is at the core of how technology and our societies and economies are evolving as we go through life together. Over the last 20 years, open source has really gobbled up software. And great book, highly recommended if you haven't read it. But basically, open source has gone from sort of this fringe, crazy idea to being central to how innovation is brought forward across every new technology megatrend and in every sector in economies, everything from automotive, mobility, transportation, logistics, and you name it. Open source software is now helping drive the innovations that are occurring in the technology sectors. And what that has meant for us as open source community members and open source developers is that there's been an ever-growing amount of responsibility that comes with being an open source developer. And so what I'm going to talk about here is a story that sort of spans 20 years of history I'm from Eclipse, so I'm going to talk about the Eclipse experience. But over 20 years of history, how the responsibilities and expectations of what it means to be a healthy open source project has evolved, and what that's meant for us at the Eclipse Foundation and the Eclipse community. So if you go way back, we're talking 20 years, people were pretty happy with an open source project that worked well. And the original Eclipse IDE was a great example. And part of the reason why it was so successful when it was first launched in late 2001 and going into 2002 was that it worked, and it worked really well. It solved a problem. Java developers and C developers in particular quickly had a professional tool set that they could use that was completely open source. And that's what the project team really focused on. And in terms of getting it to work, a lot of the early focus was on testing, and more testing. And really they came up with this development process that was a test-driven process for testing for correctness, for testing for performance and resources. And a lot of the early work that went on in driving unit testing and so on came from folks like Eric Gamma, who worked within the Eclipse community on the Java development tools. So the original focus, just on an open source project is, let's get this thing to work and provide value. After a few years of that, then there was a lot more, the focus kind of changed a bit. And it was really like, who's using our stuff? And just to put this into perspective, when the Eclipse IDE originally launched, that picture there was the download server. It was a 486 PC hooked up to nowhere near a strong enough bandwidth internet connection. And that's where the downloads first started from. And so, expectations around adoption were very, very modest and grew particularly fast. To the point where very quickly, we were measuring millions of downloads per month. And that was, something that we took a lot of pride in and measured. And we also looked at things like, how are we impacting various markets? And this is back in in the Japan market for development tools for Java. And in 2002, Eclipse was almost a rounding error. And then just a couple of years later, in 2004, it had jumped to 61% market share. And we saw this basically on a worldwide basis, the Eclipse IDE taking up to 70% of market share in Java developers. Obviously that's changed since, but the point being was, again, how do we measure health of the project? And originally it was all about performance and fitness to purpose and so on. Now, how much of a market impact are we having? And after we got to that, then we really switched the focus again, and measuring the health of the project started to be focusing on adopters. Who is using the technologies from the Eclipse community and the Eclipse Foundation. And as part of that, but by adopters, what we really mean are organizations, other open source communities, but in many cases, companies that are building products on top of the technology. And there's a couple of things that we did at the Eclipse Foundation to help adoption, and IP policy being one of them. And we had a very, very much an IP policy for many years that was focused on the needs of our adopters, much more so than the needs of our developers. And again, this was because our definition of a healthy open source project at that time was partially around having healthy adoption. And another thing that we did was around predictability. So we started doing this thing called the simultaneous release train, where we were actually sending out annual releases of the Eclipse IDE. And we've been doing this now for many years, and it's been on time to the day for going on 14, 15 years now. And that's really quite an accomplishment for an open source community. It takes a lot of work to orchestrate all of the work of many people, projects, and companies to deliver on time to the day. And we were doing this because the health of the projects that we were looking at was around fostering adoption and largely commercial adoption. And this really worked. I mean, if you look at a lot of people think of Eclipse, they think of the Java development tools, but if you look across the embedded C and C++ world, the Eclipse CDT has been very, very widely adopted. Around 2006, the focus kind of shifted a little bit from supporting adoption to also starting to consciously think about ecosystems and ecosystem development. And this was enabled by the original Eclipse IDE vision and Eclipse RCP, Rich Client Platform vision, of having an architecture of participation where it was very, very simple to extend the Eclipse IDE. And that led to having what was Eclipse plugins that were first-class citizens, and this model worked really well for us, leading to the development of the Eclipse Marketplace around this time, which had thousands of plugins and millions of downloads in support of the Eclipse IDE and Eclipse RCP. But then around 2007, our focus changed again, and we've started to focus on contributors. One of the things that we were noticing was that our projects were healthy and robust on many measures in terms of activity and so on, but we were not doing as well as we wanted to do in terms of attracting, the classical open source community drive-by contributor, and we were putting too many barriers in their way. And so the kinds of things that we really focused on for quite a while was how many committers and so on were on a project and the velocity. But then we started switching to focusing on the diversity and the contributions for our projects. And here's an example of a project that's actually is not very diverse and is not attracting a lot of contribution. But the original Eclipse IDE project over the years has transitioned to being a very diverse and very active contributor community. And that's been, we think of this as a huge open source success story, because it started off as being very insular and closed project to one which is now extremely open. And one of the things that we do at Eclipse and we've done for many years is actually track the companies that are contributing to our open source projects. And we do this in particular to be transparent. But this has really helped evolve the the projects in many ways in terms of measuring where the contributions are coming from. Around 2007, we started to really take security more seriously. I mean, it's amazing today to think of a world where, you know, the Eclipse IDE download, the EXE, for many, many years was not signed. And we did not sign any of the plugins that were being produced by the Eclipse projects as well. And so around 2007, we started to doing some, you know, very, very basic security, just simply signing the artifacts that were produced by the Eclipse Foundation. And again, it's amazing today to think of a world that was where this was even conceivable or possible, but it absolutely was. So again, you know, now for many years after that point, then, you know, measuring the health of a project, you know, what you were doing about security and doing simple things like signing and so on started to become part of the definition. Around 2010, there was a big change across the open source ecosystem with the emergence of social coding. And you have to remember that for the Eclipse Foundation, the Apache Software Foundation, you know, many of these older open source foundations, hosting your own forge was a very big part of what an open source foundation did. And it was definitely quite a switch to think about not having your projects on your own infrastructure. And, you know, this really impacted us at the Eclipse Foundation because we had to figure out a way how to get off of CVS. Yes, for many years, we actually used CVS and get on to Git and GitHub. And, you know, so we put together a proposal and we worked through this. One of the things that we really focused on in terms of our approach to GitHub and to all external services was what we call freedom of action. And so if we put our project's code onto GitHub, what happens if GitHub goes away? I know that's a crazy thought, but in perhaps not quite as crazy in 2010, but just in general, to ensure that we as an institution have freedom of action should any of the external services that we have goes down. Moving along, for us, we're probably a little bit late to the party, but starting around 2013, there was a lot more interest and activities around creating a diverse community in open source in general, and certainly at the Eclipse Foundation. You know, doing a community code of conduct and these kinds of sort of very basic activities to improve and support diversity in our projects, and making sure that our community and our events are warm and welcoming. You know, this became very much part of the overall definition of a healthy open source project. Around 2014, long-term sustainability became a real big deal, and the Heartbleed bug with Open SSL was a great example of that. But it became very much front and center about what is the long-term sustainability for a healthy open source project. And that's something that we take very seriously and always have at the Eclipse Foundation. So, you know, just to give you one example of the kinds of things that we do is we had a project, Eclipse Burt, that had gone basically very quiet, and it had users and adopters who definitely wanted to contribute to it and keep it going. And at the Eclipse Foundation, we were able to go in and basically remove all the inactive committers and contributors and reboot the project and bring on new committers and new contributors to the project and basically reinvigorate it. And that is, by the way, one of the things that we see as a core role for foundations in general is to help the long-term sustainability of the projects under our stewardship. Then around 2017, security of open source became an even bigger deal. That was when we, the Eclipse Foundation, first became a CVE numbering authority, put together a formal security vulnerability reporting package and a policy, assembled a security team, and started really managing security as a first-class issue across our entire community and projects. Then around 2021, everybody remembers SolarWinds, and I'm sure, and all of the supply chain security issues that came up around that time, which eventually led to the executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity, that specifically called out the provenance of open source software and making sure that software products were capable of being tracked, which open source code that they're using, largely so that you can get back to via a software bill of materials to get back to what the code is vulnerable, how you can get back to it and make sure whether your deployed product is or is not vulnerable. And so this really kind of heightened the awareness of supply chain security across the entire open source ecosystem, and something that we really started to take seriously at the Eclipse Foundation as well. One of the things that we did there was bring on a new project called Eclipse Steady, which is a security scanning tool, and that can be used for scanning Java and Python code. It's actually a pretty cool solution for doing that. Of course, 100% open source. Then in 2021, there was the launch of the Green Software Foundation, another offshoot from the Linux Foundation, and starting to talk about carbon neutral coding and the aspects of how can we make sure that we're minimizing the carbon impact of our coding practices and our software development processes. And so that's yet another definition for what a healthy open source project might look like. And then even more recently, just even a couple of weeks ago, there was an event in Washington, D.C. Hosted by the OpenSSF on securing the open source software that came up with this proposal that $150 million a year was going to be needed to help secure the open source ecosystem. Frankly, I think that's a start, perhaps, but a drop, really a drop in the bucket in terms of what this is really going to cost and how it's really going to what it's really going to take to secure the open source ecosystem in any meaningful way. So basically, to recap, what we're talking about here is what defines a healthy open source project and a healthy open source project community. And in early days, it really was, get in there, roll up your sleeves, and make your code work. Make it test, make it perform, make it scale, make it work. And then there's additional definitions of health that came along, like how many people are using our things, how many people are adopting our technologies. Can we build an ecosystem around this platform that we're working on? Focus on contributors and contributor diversity became more important, and of course, diversity in particular is in many different definitions and dimensions of diversity. More and ever increasing attention to security, both in terms of the security of the code itself, some basic hygiene around signing and so on, but also security in supply chain security is ever increasing. Moving from having your own forge to being out there in social coding platforms like GitHub and later GitLab, supporting social justice with codes of conducts and diversity initiatives, more security, more supply chain security, green open source, and yet again more security. So these are all part of the ever evolving definition of health in open source projects and communities. So in summary, if you think about it, what was the 2002 definition of a healthy open source project? Well, it worked and it solved a problem. And that was really it. It really, these were, 20 years ago was a long time, and it's hard to remember, but that really was the level of expectation that, it was licensed and it solved the problem. Now, if you take a look at the definition of a healthy open source project, it's a lot more complicated. So I need a deep breath before I can go through this sentence, but I would say that today, the expectation of what is a healthy open source project is a working, secure, and carbon neutral code delivered on an environmentally friendly, sustainable, predictable, repeatable, and supply chain secure basis from hardened modern infrastructure with millions of users and thousands of GitHub stars, along with a plethora of adopters and a large dynamic ecosystem, all delivered by a diverse and welcoming community governed in an open and transparent manner with a commitment to equity and social justice. That's a big change. And so it's kind of like, told you so. With great power comes great responsibility. So as open source has become more and more important to the economies, to the rate of innovation across all of our economies, as open source has become more important to our societies, and now even with things like the White House executive order, open source is showing up in the context of national security. So with great power comes great responsibility. And I think this is something that's really been impacting open source developers in every subtle but ever increasing ways over the last 20 years. But the amount of resources required to have a healthy open source project has increased dramatically. You can't do all of those things around those definitions of health. And you can't do all those things without significant resources. And part of the problem here really is that a lot of the tasks that we are currently using to define open source health are actually things that many developers, if not most developers, don't actually care about. Most developers want to get their code to work. Supply chain security, hardened infrastructure, these kinds of things, a lot of developers really don't actually care. And so it's getting ever increasingly difficult to get open source developers to be able or willing to focus their attention on all of the different aspects of what open source health means. Part of this is a reflection of the success of open source and the fact that because it's so successful, there's this overarching trend to industrialize and professionalize open source. And that's clearly happening, and it's not uniformly across the entire open source community and ecosystem, but it is definitely an overarching trend. And I really think that we can't keep growing this list. In fact, the list of aspects and attributes of a healthy open source project are probably already unsustainable. And as a minimum, they're changing the dynamics of how open source is created. And I think actually, with the stuff that we're talking about in security at OpenSSF, we are a member there and participating actively. I am concerned that we could end up with this sort of like two-tier, if not more tiers, kind of environment where some open source projects are regarded more highly than others, not because of what they do, but because of their security and other aspects of health and how they're measured and how they're implemented. And one definite trend as a result of this is that the ability of the hero programmer or very small teams to significantly impact the industry has been at least somewhat reduced. Not sure this is actually a real bad problem because open source has really always been a team sport, and the sort of the mythos of the hero programmer doesn't always serve us well. But it is definitely something that is changing. It is increasingly difficult for one person or a very small team to really change the world the way, Linus Torvalds did, for example. So just a few thoughts on the future. As I mentioned earlier, resources are a problem. And it seems ever increasing that the successful, impactful, healthy open source projects are going to require the increasing support of foundations, and I think more resources going into foundations to do the support to help their projects be healthy, or require the support of well-funded, actually shouldn't say startup, should say companies. Could be a, doesn't have to be a startup, but just if, even if you look in security with the stuff at OpenSSF with Google and Microsoft supporting the Alpha Omega project, and then ChainGuard getting involved there as a well-funded startup, this kind of approach of open source projects being attached to a major source of funding, or attached to a major foundation, or both, I think is going to become an increasing trend, because it's really difficult to have all the resources necessary to have a healthy open source project without that kind of support. Now, GitHub and GitLab are definitely trying to help. There's all kinds of things with build support and security scanners and dashboards and better support for licensing choices and code of conduct templates and so on. But I don't think that it's going to be quite enough to replace the increasing level of resource support that's going to be required for healthy projects. And really, I think to a large degree, this goes back to an issue that I think is throughout the open source community and ecosystem, and has been for many years, which is the consumers of open source for many, many years have looked at open source as free, as in free beer. It's like, thanks for all the code, I can get my application or product going with a limited amount of contribution back. Now, I think the vendors have got this, but figured this out, that they need to contribute more back. But I think a lot of enterprises and industrials still have to change the mental viewpoint that open source is free as in free beer to open source is free as in free puppies, and they need to contribute back to the support and to the resources necessary to help a open source project and its community remain healthy and sustainably healthy. And with that, I thank you. I hope you enjoyed my talk, and I really appreciate your time and attention. Thank you.